Feel free to grab a Bible, or the words, I think, will be on the screen behind me. Becky has just thanked the team that went up to Trebanog, but I also want to say a big thank you to you, Becky. Becky did. Becky organized it so well. It was super slick. So thank you very much, Becky, for all the stuff that you're doing in Trebanog as well. We are in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 this afternoon, so feel free to grab a Bible. And we're just going to jump straight in. If that's all right, we're going to jump straight in. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 1 to 6. I'll read it, and then I'll pray, and then we'll dive in. So Paul writes this letter to a church in the city of Corinth, and this is his second letter that he's writing, hence number 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 1 to 6. It says this: "Therefore, since through God's mercy we have this ministry, we do not lose heart. Rather, we have renounced secret and shameful ways. We do not use deception, nor do we distort the word of God. On the contrary, by setting forth the truth plainly, we commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers, so that they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For what we preach is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' made his light shine in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ." Let's just pray. Father, we thank you that you are light, that in you there is no darkness at all. Thank you that when we see you, we see all that is good and true and wonderful and beautiful, that we can say how marvelous, how wonderful you are. And Jesus, we pray this afternoon that as we think about these words that Paul penned, help us to see what you're really like. Lord, not what culture says you're like, not even what we feel you're like, but Father, what your word says you are really like. Help us to see that by your Spirit, I ask. In Jesus' name, amen. A little quiz question to get us going. I don't like pub quizzes, but I know some people absolutely love them. So for those who love pub quizzes, it's probably quite an easy answer. But does anyone know what the second biggest money-making day in the year after Christmas is? New Year's Eve you've got? Valentine's Day? Oh, this is Boxing Day? Boxing Day? Black Friday?
Valentine's Day, you say.
Valentine's Day? None of those. Keep going. Halloween. Yeah, Halloween. Halloween is the second biggest money-making day in the whole of the year after Christmas. Halloween tomorrow, the 31st of October. Not just on the day, but in the build-up to it. I'm not sure how you respond to Halloween or what you do on October the 31st. But I think Halloween highlights that we have this strange relationship with darkness. Because on the one hand, we seem quite happy to be quite light-hearted about it, and we can dress up with costumes embodying darkness and create all sorts of scary decorations and buy weird-looking and quite scary masks. We can be quite light-hearted about that. But on the other side, we can feel the uneasiness about the darkness that we get confronted with day to day. And we know something of its reality that we experience, the sinking feeling in our stomach, the experience of heaviness in our heart, something's not quite right there. And we can kind of be flippant about darkness, but also at the same time, soberingly fearful about it. And so we have this kind of strange relationship that we try and navigate in our culture. But it doesn't take much for us to admit and to realize that darkness is real and evil is in the air that we breathe. And the Bible, as it describes darkness and evil, does not treat it flippantly. It does not mess with darkness. It does not paint it out to be this kind of trivial power that we can poke if we want to have a bit of fun. Because the Bible paints a very stark picture. The darkness is real and Satan is at work. Just listen to this quite sobering verse in 1 John chapter 5. It says this: we know that we are children of God. So he says, we know that we are children of God, but then John says, and that the whole world is under the control of the evil one. That's quite a sobering verse to hear, that our world is under the control of the evil one, the influence of the evil one. And Jesus, talking about Satan, says that he comes only to steal and kill and destroy. And when we hear both those verses together, that is a heartbreaking reality of the world that we live in. That it is filled with darkness and the footprints of Satan, who is roaming to rob us of life. And in a society that doesn't want to face up to that stark reality, we've got to come to what God says in his word about the darkness and about Satan. And Paul, in his second letter to the Corinthians, writes something which I think to 21st century ears, to your ears and to my ears, makes us go, what? This is a bit strange, a bit weird. He says this in chapter 2. Feel free to flick back in your Bibles if you have them. He's talking about, there's this case in the church where someone had done something really wrong against someone else in the church. And he writes this letter and he says to them, look guys, forgive them. I have also forgiven them. And then he says why. So in chapter 2, 10 to 11, he says this: anyone you forgive, I also forgive. And he says, well, I have forgiven. If there is anything to forgive, I forgive it in the sight of Christ for your sake. In other words, forgive the person who has done something wrong. But then he says why. And I don't know what you would say to this, because I'd probably say because then we can all get on with unity, then we can all be together in this. But Paul says this really strange comment. He says, in order that Satan might not outwit us, for we are not unaware of his schemes. That is so strange to our ears. Paul wants to say, as he's writing to the Corinthians, that he doesn't want to be outdone by Satan, for he knows that Satan has strategies. The language of all of this can feel really uncomfortable to us in 21st century. But Paul was unashamed to say this and purposely writes it, that Satan is cunning and strategic, and I don't want him to have the upper hand. And Paul was aware of what Satan was up to, and so do we need to be as well. And before we look into this, it's not going to be the whole of the time. Before we look into this, this isn't the emergency fire alarm, panic. This is the information tannoy to inform us. It's to keep us alert and aware of what Satan does. So this is where we're going to go, okay? We're going to look at these verses in chapter 4, particularly 3 verses, and we're going to look at, first of all, the strategy of Satan. What is his strategy in this world? And then we're going to look at what is God's strategy in this world? What has he done in our hearts? Like, what is his strategy in this world? And then we're going to think about what is our strategy in response to that. Okay, that's where we're going over these three verses in chapter 4. What is Satan's strategy? What is God's strategy? What is our strategy in response to that? Does that all make sense? Everyone with me so far? Yeah. Great. Okay, so we're going to look at the strategy of Satan, verse 4 of this passage. So if you have your Bibles, feel free to keep it open. This is what Paul writes. He says, the God of this age, he's talking about Satan, he's talking about the evil one. He says, the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Big sentence, big words. If you don't understand it, don't worry, we're going to delve into it. So Paul writes this verse. So the question I'm going to ask is this: what is one of Satan's number one strategies in this world? Is it to keep us sinning? Maybe. Is it to keep us discouraged and kind of downtrodden? Maybe. Is it to keep us running after the idols of our hearts? Maybe. But Paul says Satan is at work to keep us blinded. One of the most biggest strategies of Satan is to keep us blinded. But blinded to what? Paul says that Satan wants to keep us from seeing, keep us blinded, keep us from seeing what? The light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. What does that mean? So let me quickly define some terms for us to help us understand what's going on. So the gospel, Paul is talking about the good news story of the whole Bible. It's a story, it's a true story, and it's a good news story. Then he uses this word which we use all the time called glory. What is that? Glory is God's worth, his infinite beauty, holy perfection, supreme goodness on display. I think someone said it's his holiness gone public. It's us being able to see what is God really like. Like, how good is he? Like, can we see that? Can we see your glory? So Paul says that Satan wants to keep us from seeing that. Satan's strategy is that at all costs, he will keep us from seeing God's supreme worth and beauty in Jesus as seen in the good news story. To keep us in the darkness, blind of any other reality. He wants you and me to see that maybe God isn't actually as glorious as he says he is. He wants us to be blinded to how good he is and all the gifts he gives us. He wants us to be blinded to how much joy is found in knowing God. He wants us to keep us from seeing the light of the gospel, the good news story of the glory, the infinite worth of God, of Christ, in Christ, who is the image of God. That's a big concept to understand. So maybe an analogy might help. Imagine for a moment two houses in the Rhondda that are next door to each other. House number 1 is the darkest, coldest, loneliest, dampest house in the Rhondda. I feel like I got a taste of the dampest last year in the house I was in. But imagine that's house number 1. Right next door to that, though, is the complete opposite. It's house number 2. It's the brightest. It's the warmest. It's the one where friendship is felt and experienced. It's the one that has like the party vibes of the Rhondda where we all want to go. It's the house where there's just joy and food and tunes that just, you want to dance in the kitchen, you know, those moments. It's a dry house as well. Number 1 and number 2. And you live, in this analogy, in number 1. And it's horrid. Absolutely horrendous. But it's all you've ever known. What would someone do to stop you from enjoying the joy and the beauty of the house next door? Blackout blinds. They'd put blackout blinds over your windows. They would put sound insulation so you can't hear what the house is doing next door. They would block up your front door so you can't walk out and go next door. They would get rid of your path so you can't go and visit the neighbor. They would do absolutely everything. They'd cover over your letterbox so you can't even get any mail about next door. They do absolutely everything to stop you from seeing what the house next door is like. And it's a very real picture and sad reality of what it's like in this world to live in darkness. Because that is exactly what Satan seeks to do. He wants us to keep us from peering out of the window to see what Jesus is really like. He wants to keep us from hearing how good the party is next door in God's house. He wants to cut off the avenues that will help us become aware of what Jesus is really like. We live in house number 1, and we just are so unaware of what's available in house number 2. He wants to keep us from seeing the light of the gospel, of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. How does this outwork itself in our lives? Because this can sound so other to some extent. Like, what does it look like in practice in our lives day to day? Let me try and apply this in 2 ways. The first is how we treat ourselves, and the second is how we treat others. So the first, how we treat ourselves when we feel guilty, ashamed, weak, or unloved. Very real experiences that you and I feel day to day in this broken world. When we're in that place when we just feel lonely, or heavy-hearted, or overwhelmed with guilt, or unloved, what does it mean that Satan wants to keep us from seeing the glory of Christ at that moment? It means he wants to keep us from seeing that in the good news of Jesus Christ, forgiveness is offered to those who are guilty. It means he wants to keep us from seeing that for those who are feeling so ashamed of their sin and the things that have been done to them, he wants to keep us from seeing that Jesus wants to stand by us as our older brother and say, I'm unashamed of you to call you my brother or sister. It means he wants to keep us from seeing that Jesus wants to take our shame and our vulnerability away from us and clothe us in the righteousness of himself. It means that when we feel unloved because of the messages that the world tells us, or when we feel downtrodden in a society that just might overlook us, Satan wants to keep us from seeing how in the gospel, Jesus extends love upon love lavishly to broken people like you and me. He wants to keep us from seeing what Jesus is really like in those moments. And what about how we treat others when we're being selfish, proud, and ungrateful? When we are being rude, living for things that please us and getting snarky with people. I wrote this literally probably a day after being snarky with Lizzie about the smallest of things to do with where a curtain should be fixed. And I realized how important it is to see daily what Jesus is really like. What does it mean that Satan wants to keep us from seeing the glory of Jesus when we're selfish, proud, and ungrateful? Satan wants to keep us from seeing that to live the way Jesus lives is truly freeing. He wants to keep us from seeing that it's better to serve others rather than to selfishly take. In moments of identity crises, or in a culture that wants to distort who we are, our identity, or when we feel just the sin in our hearts rising up to be selfish in our actions and our words and our thoughts, Satan wants to keep us from looking at Jesus and see that in him, his ways are far better, far wiser, far greater than ours. He wants to keep us from looking at the goodness and the graciousness and the kindness of Jesus towards us. Keep us in the dark and rob us of life. Keep us sitting in house number 1, then experiencing house number 2. In that world, is there hope? I so hope there is. Is there hope in that world? Let's look at the strategy of God. Paul holds up the verse that we've just read in direct contrast and says, okay, that might be what Satan tries to do, but just listen to what God is like. He says this: "For God who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ." Such an amazing verse. Paul puts this verse in direct contrast to what we've just read. And before he kind of jumps on to what God's strategy is, he's like, I want to tell you, first of all, church, what God is actually like. And by doing that, he takes us back to the passage in Genesis. And he said, "For God who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,'" he's taken us back to one of the early verses in Genesis chapter 2, where it says, darkness was hovering over the face of the deep. Darkness was there. And then, into nothing and without nothing, God speaks, and light dispels the darkness. Just think about that for a moment. With nothing and into nothing, God speaks and darkness goes. Paul is saying, the God that can do this, the miracle of creating everything out of nothing, the miracle of bringing order into the midst of chaos, the miracle of bringing beauty into display in this creation, at the very word of his mouth, that God, the one who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," this all-powerful and almighty God has done a similar thing in every single one of your hearts if you're a Christian. That is astounding. Paul says God has dispelled the darkness in our hearts. Why? Because he has shone in our hearts the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. The thing that Satan wants to keep hidden from us, God wants to open our eyes to. And this is what God is like, and this is what he does. The work of God the Father is to help us by his Spirit coming into our hearts, to help us to see, to take away the blindness, to help us to see what Jesus is like. If he's able to speak everything into existence with nothing but words, he is able to shine his light upon our hearts and minds. Like, is there hope in this dark world? Yes. Like Paul says, yes, there is. And Christians, we have it. God has done something in our hearts. And if you felt overwhelmed by what Satan is at work to do, Paul wants to press home to us that God is better able to illuminate than Satan is able to keep us blind. Because God so desires to show us just how good he is. He's better able to illuminate than Satan is able to keep us blind. Back to the analogy. Imagine, like I said, you're living at number 1. The darkest, coldest, loneliest, dampest house in the Rhondda. Feels like an award, that, doesn't it? Not an award you want. Imagine you living in that, unaware of next door, number 2. The brightest, warmest, friendship-filled, like dancing, party tunes, feast, joy, dry house. What does God do? He doesn't just kind of get rid of the blackout blinds. He He doesn't just kind of make a path so that he's able to come to your front door and tell you about next door. He doesn't just kind of take away the insulation so that you're able to hear about the house next door. He comes knocking. And he comes knocking to invite you in. He comes knocking to say, hey, look, I've enabled a way for you to come and enjoy life with me in number 2. And you walk the most treacherous path of your garden, the darkest garden, to save you from the darkest house and bring you at the cost of his life into his house under his care. Yeah. That's what Jesus has done for you if you're a Christian. That's what Jesus puts on offer to us today, to enjoy life under his care. So hear this verse again. For God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, has made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. But I want us just to see this. I want us to see that it's not just some vague reality of God, that God has shone the light in our hearts. He hasn't just made us see, oh, there's this God and that's it. He's done something more than that. It's the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ as displayed in the gospel, as Paul says. In other words, what Paul is saying is we see God most clearly as we gaze on Jesus. Yeah. And we see Jesus most clearly as we gaze in the gospel. Not just the gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but the gospel, the good news story of the whole Bible, that is also embodied in creation, that God is good, that God is kind towards us. Paul is trying to get us to see that darkness is dispelled as we gaze on the public display of God's perfect beauty and goodness and kindness and mercy and graciousness towards you and me, as displayed in the whole Bible. I want to read you a quote which tries to unpack this for us. It's quite a large quote, but hopefully you'll follow this with me. This is what someone said about how this kind of outworks in our lives. They said at the cross, that is at the pinnacle of the gospel, the cross and the resurrection, the pinnacle of the good news story. At the cross, true wisdom and power, holiness, goodness, love, and sovereignty of God are revealed in all their surprising beauty, winning hearts of those who look to him, that's to God. And while God is always wise, powerful, holy, good, loving, sovereign, that's over all things, we do not understand or see that correctly apart from Christ. His sovereignty, for example, we would mistake for cold tyranny or unfeeling government. His goodness we would take for weak indulgence. When the glory of God is displayed on the cross, we get to see all God's perfections. We see that God is not merely helpful to the weak, but patient and infinitely merciful to great sinners. We see riches of his grace, his sovereign power to save, his holy justice and his love. But more, through the cross, we see a love so fierce, it pierces our apathy and overwhelms desire for other things. At the cross, we see in the majestic goodness of Christ and the sweet security we have in him. That is why it can transform the vicious, the sad, the despairing, and the selfish into joy-filled, radiantly generous, and kind saints. What an amazing description of what it's like to gaze upon the good news of what Jesus has done for us and what he's really like. Okay, in the final few minutes, we have the strategy for ourselves. Verse 5. What does all that mean for us? What does it mean for you and me today? I want to give us 3, and they are pretty brief, I hope. 3 brief things. The first is this. We need God to shine the light into our hearts if we're unbelievers. Paul says this in verse 3. And even if our gospel is veiled, in other words, we can't see it, we can't see what Jesus is like, it is veiled to those who are perishing. Paul describes what it's like to live in house number 1. He says it leads to death. And I think one of the worst things about that is that we can't open our eyes to see ourselves. We're not able to see or open the window and see what house number 2 is like. We just can't see it. We haven't got the power to overcome, to help us to see what is God really like. We're blind. Our sin plunges into darkness and blindness, and Satan wants to keep us there. And we just desperately, we have to hold our hands up and say, God, we need rescuing from that. But here's the promise of the Bible. In chapter 3, verse 16, Paul plainly and clearly gives us a promise to hear. He says, but when anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. We hold up our hands and say, I can't see what God is really like. But God says, no, you can't. But if you turn to me, I will take away the blindness and the veil that stops you from seeing what I'm really like. And so God invites you to turn to him. And so if you haven't turned to him, Paul pleads with you and says, turn to the Lord that you may see what he's really like. The love, the secure love that he has for you. We need God to shine into our hearts, to shine the light into our hearts if we're unbelievers. Number 2, we need to gaze to the end of our days at Jesus as displayed in the gospel by the power of his Spirit. Chapter 3, 17 to 18 says these words, now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And then he says, and we all, with unveiled faces, those as Christians we're able to now see, we contemplate or we gaze at what? Like, what do we spend our days doing? Gaze at the Lord's glory. And we're being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. Paul says this. He says, God has done the decisive work of opening our eyes to a reality that we could not do before. Just how infinitely wonderful Jesus is. And he says that the response of the believer is therefore to use the eyes that God has opened to gaze at him. How? By looking at Jesus, by the power of his Spirit. Now the Lord is a Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. It means this. It means in the pit of the despair that we feel in this life, gaze at Jesus. It means that when we're having the most joyful time, gaze at Jesus. It means when we're experiencing guilt, gaze at Jesus. It means when we're experiencing shame or just our days of our identity just feel a bit shaky, gaze at Jesus. It feels like when doubts are rising and they threaten to flood, gaze at Jesus. And plead that God's Spirit would come more into our hearts to show us, to take more of the veil away, to show us with clarity that in Jesus we have the secure love to make us secure. We have the forgiveness that meets our guilt. You can never look enough at the infinite worth of your Creator and Savior. The well of God's glory can never be drawn empty, and the lake of God's goodness can never be drunk dry. And the third application, we need to proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord. Paul says in between Satan's strategy and God's strategy, this verse, he says, for what we preach or what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. Here is someone who has grasped the glory of God, what it's like to behold, to see what God is really like. And Paul says our whole life, not just in what we say, but in the actions that we take, in the decisions that we make, must display, surely, that Jesus is King, that he really is the Lord. We once lived at number 1, the darkest, coldest, loneliest, dampest house in the Rhondda leading to death, unaware of number 2, the brightest, warmest, friendship-filled, party-driven, joy, dry house experiencing life. And God in Jesus gave his life to come knocking, to shine the light of his glory and invite you in, to show you the sweetness of living at number 2 and to invite you to experience that yourself. And we've come to realize when we go and live in number 2, we've come to realize that there is nowhere else we would rather be. That there is no one else we would rather be under. That he truly has become the Lord of our lives. So the miracle on offer to those who aren't Christians, and to the Christian, the miracle that we have received and that we can to some extent keep on receiving is this. The God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," has shone in your hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Let's pray, and then we'll take communion together. Jesus, you are